Hey, welcome to the New Breed of Business. Today we're going to talk about governmental debt. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining in this morning. The New Breed of Business is really about God's perspective on economy, business practice, financial methods, and so forth. We have a strategy that's called the storehouse vision about how to approach that from a biblical standpoint. Today's discussion, we're going to get into aspects of larger governments, the debt that's accumulated all over the world, and the consequence of that. And one of the interesting things I just wanted to share is that I'm part of a national team, we have a podcast called the Last Call Podcast. It's about the events leading up to Jesus' return and how to pray and act. And one of the things that we're up to right now is sending a letter to all of our federal officials in the executive, judicial, and legislative branches, a warning of what happens when countries do not follow in the ways of God. They sin against Him. Judgment must come. It's a biblical pattern. It's a historical pattern. You just start with Daniel's statue, if you remember, the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, where there were all these empires in world history, and they all fell. They were all judged. Israel was even judged, which is God's chosen people and nation, yet to be reformed and brought back. But we see this pattern. And my friend Alan Parker, who is the president of the Justice Foundation, he's been an advocate in the Supreme Court arena, writing briefs and arguing there for the rights of the unborn, against abortion and killing, or what would biblically be called the shedding of innocent blood. So he has put forth a framework. It's a biblical framework. Other people have a similar framework, which is when a nation commits the four great sins against God, they come under his judgment. And the four great sins are um, uh, forsaking God or moving away from him and his ways, shedding of innocent blood, sexual immorality, and the final point that he makes is greed. Another way of saying it is the love of money, or um, the trust in money instead of God. So this letter is a letter that writes about the period of history that we're in, addressed to the government, saying time is running short. If we don't turn back to God, things are going to get worse and worse. So why is that important? Part of that letter actually highlights the national debt as being a curse, as being a form of judgment. Biblically, God talks about debt being a slavery. And he called Israel, his chosen nation amongst the nations, to be the lender, not the borrower. And when they were in God's good graces, in obedience, they would be in that position. And when they weren't, they would go into debt and then be at uh, the debt of other nations. And so part of our discussion here today is this government debt issue. Now, we all know about the government debt. We've been talking about it for a long time. We, in fact, even if you go back, there's a write up and a podcast that we did 4 years ago about it very specifically. That's in the link. That's in the notes of this discussion. But what caught my attention was this new book that is coming out, written by Ray Dalio. Now, Ray Dalio is the founder of the biggest hedge fund in the world. It's called Bridgewater. It's right here where I live. It's right here where we started our hedge fund in Westport, Connecticut. And this book is very interesting. He is using the book as a warning. Okay, so here we have someone who doesn't believe in Jesus. I believe he uh, may even meditate and have sort of Buddhist leanings. I'm not quite sure, but um, he is essentially saying, based on all of his experience and his studying of history and the cycles, and he's even studied the biblical history of how nations have risen and fallen. He is sending a warning out, essentially in this book, putting forth a thesis saying if we don't address our debt in the next 3 years, we're going to end up in a irreversible spiral. So I'm just going to read you This quote, this is chapter 16 of his new book. At this time, I judge the long-term risks of U.S. government debt to be very high because the current and projected levels of U.S. government debt and debt service and sales of new debt and debt to be rolled over are the highest ever. And there are big debt rollover risks ahead. We'll talk about rollover risk in a minute. In fact, I judge the U.S. government's debt situation to be nearing the point of no return. By that, I mean that the debt and the debt service levels are beyond those that can be reduced without great losses to debt investors because such levels are of self-reinforcing debt in a death spiral occurs due to the need to borrow to service that debt and interest rates rising because the risks of holding the debt currency become apparent. So, in essence, he's saying we're right at the point where we're borrowing just to service the interest on our existing debt. And when you have to replace the existing debt with new issued debt, you have to have buyers who are willing to buy that debt. If you don't have buyers willing to buy the debt, you then have to print money, and the central bank has to buy the debt. And you could start to see how this all works and falls apart. We don't need to nitpick about the details of it. I just think here's a guy who basically made his whole career and arguably is the most successful hedge fund manager of all time. He made that in trading bonds. He made that in trading currencies. So he's a studier of this and he's simply following the numbers and the history. And he talks about the cycle and the business cycle. And then he talks about the long-term debt cycle. And this is about 80-year-long cycle. And he is saying that we're at the end of that cycle. So he's saying, like, we have to be very careful. And he uses this analogy in his book of a person and their physician. And he uses this analogy of it's like plaque building up in your arteries. If you don't do something about it, you end up where the plaque grows to such a point that it can break off and cause a heart attack. And that heart attack is obviously to a person a random event. You don't know when that's coming. It just happens kind of out of the blue. And essentially, he's saying here that we are at that point analogously with the nation's debt. And because the nation really is the world's reserve currency, we're at this tipping point. All right. So now we've talked about the debt and sounding the alarm on that for a long time. I think one of the risks we have right now, especially if you're a Republican, is you think President Trump has been elected, so now we're going to have economic successes. We're going to be in a better financial position in GDP growth and so on and so forth. But just the warning is be vigilant because that's probably a misplaced understanding, meaning this risk, as Dalio and others, there's other people who are saying this, by the way. You've got Warren Buffett, who's warning. Similarly, you had about 10 years ago the guy who founded PIMCO, another huge bond management fund. I believe his name is Bill Gross, said, I'm no longer going to be investing in U.S. treasuries. And he's saying it for similar reasons. So I think what's important to remember is we're not bulletproof as the United States. There is still much unrepented sin. We've turned back perhaps a measure, but if we don't keep repenting, if we don't keep turning back, as Jonathan Cahn has warned, for example, as a national and prophetic voice, we're going to have more trouble, and the trouble could be big trouble. And I think that's why we're talking about it today. What can we do about it? We can sit here and discuss it and debate it, and that has like some educational benefit. But the real thing that we can do about it is focus on, okay, how do we make sure that we have local relationships and we are locally working together with others, especially believers in the unity of Christ, and not just trusting in chariots and horses, but trusting in God, meaning not just trusting in the system we have, the debt we have. We'll just issue some more debt. We'll raise the debt ceiling. We'll borrow some more. It'll be okay. The Federal Reserve will help us. It'll take care of things. We'll carve out some waste in the government and we'll make it better. We can't just trust in that, right? So we're encouraging people turn to the Lord and go back to the biblical fundamentals of what Jesus has taught us in terms of how to look at economics and money, how to treat people, how to be in a relationship, and not trust in man, trust in God. So, with that, we're going to open this discussion up now. Has anybody read or seen this book or know of Ray Dalio?
Is the book out on the market yet?
It's going to be released in print in September, but it's been released on the internet and you can get it through LinkedIn. It's was actually in the email, but and it'll be in the write-up.
Okay.
The working cover is that red graphic that was in the email. I'm going to show it to you just here on the screen. All right. So has anybody ever heard of Ray Dalio?
Yep.
Yes.
And you may have followed him or seen that now that he's kind of come out of Bridgewater, he's becoming more public in trying to do a number of things, but help educate people, share his principles of success. So that's normal. Like Jack Welch did that when he came out of GE and others. But specifically, he's been warning people about this dynamic and trying to help educate and let people understand. But most people, and even lawmakers today, face very difficult uh, decisions with what do we do with these big problems? There's no political will to do much about it. So, what can we do? And a lot of times, of course, the can gets kicked down the street. The can being the hard decisions come later. You may remember, for example, like 10 years ago or 15, there was the European debt crisis where there was austerity that was required for countries like Greece, Spain, Italy. And that's because it got so out of control, their markets just started spiraling. So something had to be done in an emergency basis. And sometimes we think like we're undefeatable, we're unsinkable, we're the greatest nation on earth. President Trump talks about the golden age we're going to come into. Well, maybe we are, but have we repented fully, or are we subject to this judgment that is biblically prescribed if a nation turns away from me? And as we said, like there's a measure of turning back towards God, but is it full? Is it complete? Um, do we trust in God or do we trust in our money, our machines, our central bank, our stock markets, our bond markets, our economy? So this is food for thought and consideration. And so I think reading a book like this brings us back to the sober truth of where we stand in terms of this economic issue of the debt levels, and that we're not unsinkable. And we just have to be careful because if we have that kind of pride or arrogance, assuming we're just going to be blessed by God, well, the pattern of that was actually biblically back in Israel, because the rulers of their day, leading up to judgment, both in Israel and then later in Judea, the leaders were saying the same thing. Like we're God's country. This will never happen. We're unsinkable, and they weren't. So, any thoughts about that?
Do you think that some of the actions that Trump and Elon Musk are taking will make a dent in this problem?
That's a great question. I put in the write up in the email that's there's a lot of politics that are running around that, right? But in principle, it is a great thing to cut bureaucracy, to remove waste and get rid of fraud and highlight areas that are just completely ridiculous way of spending taxpayers' money. We need that desperately. So for that, it's a very good thing. Now, the savings that is going to come out of that the reports so far seem to be that we're tracking, at least for the first year, they're towards their goal of $1 trillion being eliminated. The issue is, will it really be $1 trillion, or like a lot of spending in either a corporation or government tends to snap back. You cut it, but then you realize, oh wait, we still have to do those other things, and okay, we got to put some more cost back into it. So one, will we get that $1 trillion? And if we do, let's say we get it in the first year, will we get it every year thereafter? And then the question is, what do we do with the savings? Do we cut back as austerity, or as kind of the president's been hinting at, do we redirect those resources to other political priorities? Infrastructure is one that's been spoken about. We need to spend more on infrastructure. Defense is another. We need to spend more on defense. Um, and so forth. So, that this is kind of an open question, and I think we have to again be looking at this eyes wide open. Like, this is good, right? This is a good movement here. It's very politically charged, of course, but what will we do with the savings? Will we really? So Dalio argues in his thesis, by the way, our deficits are at 7.5% of GDP. He's saying we have to at least get that back to 3% at a minimum. And if we don't do that, we're going to have a heart attack economically, and we can't sustain this debt, and it's going to spiral. That's his warning. So, can we get to that? Well, if we don't, so if we re-up the tax cuts, that costs uh, reduced revenue. You get some of that back with increased GDP, but not all of it is typically what happens. So you've got these savings, but if you reprioritize them to other spending, you've spent that too. So that's one of these open questions. Is it really going to get us back? The last time we've had a reduction of the debt, I think, has been ages ago. Like, the last time we have reductions of deficits, I want to say in a major way, was under um, the Clinton administration. That's when we reduced the deficit. Not sure if we actually reduced the debt at that period. And if you remember, one of the big turning points in the nation was looked upon historically as a great moment for our nation. Like, a lot of people, I'm one of them, who looked at the Reagan administration as some of America's greatest days, and we turned around from hyperinflation and a lot of economic trouble into more growth. But one of the people who warned that that was not a full solution was this guy, David Stockman. He was the budget director. He was one of the key economic guys of the Reagan administration. And he was saying, if we don't take our savings that we're trying to take costs out of the government, and with our tax cuts, which we're stimulating the economy, if we don't repurpose if we don't reduce the costs at the same time we do the tax cuts, we're going to have a problem, because we're going to grow the deficit and therefore grow the debt. That was his warning. He warned President Reagan directly, and they chose, the administration, to ignore that and effectively increase the deficits during the 80s. So, of course, the economy improved. That's what happens when you borrow and spend. But Stockman was saying, unless you go back to a balanced budget and have some austerity, you're kicking the can down the road, and this problem is going to become even bigger later. So this is the risk we have now. There's more tax cuts to come in terms of this. There's the re-upping of the existing tax cuts, but there's also the new tax cuts. If you remember, on the campaign trail, President Trump said, we're not going to tax tips. We're not going to tax like some other things. I forget what they were.
Social Security.
Social Security, right? So, okay, so if we eliminate $1 trillion of waste, but then we reduce the revenue through cutting the taxes, again, that yes, you recover some of them back in the GDP growth, hopefully. It's not a guarantee, but it's not all of it. So then we could quickly be at the same kind of deficit level as we stand today. And
I
that's a
think,
risk. And I think
uh,
that's what Dalio is saying, is like, hey, It's got to be real. It can't just be kind of a feel-good moment.
I think what the president and his Treasury Secretary Musk, they're certainly well aware of the problem, and they're talking about reducing the deficit spending, which would not increase the debt, and then somewhere further down the road to reduce the actual debt, which I think is almost impossible. But they talk about it, and they also use the examples that in the first Trump administration, when they reduced taxes, the actual government revenues increased far beyond what they tax cuts, took away.
Well, again, you got to be careful with that. It didn't actually increase on an absolute basis. What it did was it increased on a marginal basis. So it's not, in other words, hey, if we get rid of taxes entirely, that'll solve the problem. It won't, right? So you can't, that works. You get some of it back. Like there's no doubt about it. That's the Laffer curve, if you're familiar with that
Yep.
economically. So you can recapture and it can be a good thing. But Stockman was essentially warning if you don't be disciplined about cutting your budget, it will fail you ultimately and eventually. Because what you're doing is you're borrowing, and if you continue to borrow and you get a GDP growth, that's good, but you're kind of like it's kind of like you feel good about yourself, but you're building the plaque up while you're doing it. And that's back to Dalio's analogy. Um, and so, yes, it's like, and ultimately, I think we always talk about the practical implications of what do we do, but also like what will practically happen if we ignore these issues in reality. But it's all points back to where are we at spiritually in the
Mm.
country? And are we following God and returning back to Him and fully repenting? Because if we're not, we're going to fool ourselves. And in our pride, we're going to make mistakes and we're going to think we're invincible. We're going to think that we're wonderful. We're going to think we're great. And if we're not careful, that will then set us into the waters of this heart attack situation. So I think that's something to pray into. But the way we can respond to it, as we've talked about, is we can go back to economically and from a monetary standpoint. Let's not trust in our money and our systems. Let's trust God. Let's do what the Bible says to do, and He can make a way even where there is no way. I think that's really in humility the place where we need to be, especially as Christians and hopefully as a nation, going low and like being humble about it and really addressing what's left undone. So again, like we have part of the measures of Roe v. Wade is being overturned. That's a positive. Are babies still being aborted in our nation? Yes, they are. So that's a partial, right? A lot of things that have come out in this administration of putting the end to a lot of the nonsense of and unnatural things of transgenderism and uh, exchanging men and women's sports and things like that. Well, that's a positive from a biblical standpoint, but have we gone further? What about all types of sexual immorality? What about the ease of divorce? What about cheating on our wives? What about homosexuality? What about pornography? What about all these other things? Like, have we done that? And that's really, if we're objective about it, we haven't. Right? Hollywood is one of the greatest exporters of entertainment, and the everyone knows and says sex sells. So now we have what's really become even more difficult is sex sells and pornography sells even better. But our television shows, I'm sure we all know this if we look at it, they've come up with rating systems now that are new, different from the film rating system. So in the old days, it was like, oh, if a movie's rated X, it's really bad and sexual. Today, we have all these TV shows, they're rated M. The M rating is the same as an X rating. There are sexual, all sorts of stuff that's going on in it. It's not to point out, it's just to be real about it, right? It's not to say, oh, we're better and you're worse. It's just we have to be honest with ourselves, right? So I think when you look at that and you look at how have we gone on sexual immorality, how have we done on that? Are we turning back to God in that? Are we having, are we refocused on marriage and the sanctity of that and like a lifelong commitment to that? And if we're not, the history shows. So one of the things that Dalio does in his natural analysis, right, is let's look at history. Let's look at this empire. Let's look at the Roman Empire. Let's look at what happened in the Weimar Republic of Germany. Let's look at post World War II, pre World War II. So he's a student of all of that, and he's making his own warnings. But if we are a student of the Bible, we also know that when a nation turns from God, this is out of Jeremiah, um, God is a just God and he has to judge that nation. And he continues to judge that nation in the modern day. It's not like it's Old Testament only. And so that's the reality of what we need to remain vigilant on. And then when you come to the greed side of things, like there's a lot of I would argue, as we often talk about, there's a lot of blind spots in the US about how much we trust in our money. A lot of people don't think we do or don't admit that. Again, the machinery and the systems and the trading systems and everything else, like they're all tied together. How much do we trust in that? 75% of our GDP is basically driven off of those financial markets in the publicly traded realm. Um, and are we self-oriented in that, or are we God honoring and God oriented in that? It's a question for all of us, right? Are we self-interested and self-reliant, or are we gut trusting in God and honoring what He says and not exploiting the poor and making sure that we help the helpless and actually in our business practices are doing things that are not just for profit; they are for a fear of having a fear of God um, and so forth. So just to back that up, if we really look at a scorecard of how we're doing in repentance, I mean, I think we maybe are better than we were. You can argue about that. A lot of people think that's not true. But let's say we are. But have we completed that work? Have we gone all the way? Have we stopped short? And do we have pride in our position? And we know that pride, what's the scripture? I think it's in Proverbs. Pride comes before the fall. So if pride comes before the fall, we just need to, again, be vigilant and not think we're um, invincible. Uh, and if we're not entering into a golden age, we just have to understand that and be ready as servants of God to help people and not be trusted or completely reliant upon the systems that could be trouble. Dalio saying, warning, 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 those systems could all blow up in a heart attack. He's a smart guy. He's built the biggest investment fund in the world. So if we're not listening to God and Jonathan Cahn's warning, at least we should listen to people like Bill Gross
The
or
secular warning.
or Ray Dalio and say, hey, there's probably something that is true to that. Um,
Great.
so
You go
go
back for
for it.
a second and just explain the difference between deficit and debt, because I was thinking it was the same thing.
Well,
It's,
here's the difference.
it's something that's negative, right?
They're both negative. Yeah. So deficits grow the debt remains and accumulates.
Okay.
So every year when we have a deficit, so I'll show you a picture that we had in the email. Just hold on a sec. All right, can everybody see that bar chart?
Yeah.
So the US deficit compared to revenue and spending 2024. We took in federal receipts 4.92 trillion. That's the revenue in the blue here. We had a spend though of nearly 7 trillion, and this orange box is the deficit. So we have to fill in the hole that remains just in 1 year of $2 trillion of new debt being added to the debt pile. And so we're at $36 trillion in debt. And if you go back just 5 years, 10 years ago, that was much smaller. Um, Another warning of Dalio's is this. Even in the history of all of the world and all of empires rising and falling and money failing, we have this is an unprecedented level of debt all around the world.
Mhm.
Unprecedented in absolute terms, but more interestingly, unprecedented in relative terms. We've never had so much leverage in the system as we do today. We've never had so much debt compared to the GDP of the world ever than today. So Dalio's kind of saying not only is it like in this 80-year thing where we can have another 1920s, 30s event globally, like the
Mhm.
Great Depression, it could be worse because we've never been here before. We've never had this kind of debt issue globally. So again, that's important. And so deficits every year, 2 trillion last year, probably 2 trillion the year before. I haven't got the numbers here. That's adding to that debt tally or tab. It's interesting because Dalio has some very basic analogies he uses in some of his teaching materials and videos, and one of them is the bar tab. It's like you go into the bar and you have another beer and you put it on your tab. And the bar tab
Greg,
is federal debt.
Greg, question. How does that compare with some of the other major economies? For instance, the debt of China or the debt of India or the debt of the EU?
Yeah, it's a great question. And in some of our prior talks where we highlight Japan, Japan's the worst country from that perspective. So we're about 100% debt to GDP right now. Japan is double that and even a little bit higher.
Oh my goodness.
And if you look back, and I can even bring this up here online live, if you look back at the analysis we did, you'll see how Japan is a good country to look at as a forerunning country going into worse and worse debt and having tremendous systemic problems. So if we look for that chart, they were the pioneers in monetizing debt. That's code for printing money. So when central banks monetize the debt, they end up buying their own debt. That's like eating your own eating
Children.
your own refuse, and it's not healthy. And so um, let's just see if we can bring it up. Okay, so can you see that chart? First Japan, then the US and Europe. The stock
No.
market crash of 1989 was the first major stock market crash that was long lasting. It happened in Japan, 1989. They're still recovering from that. We're now what, 35 years later, more? They're still recovering from the late 80s and what happened there. We went through a similar event in 2008 with the financial crisis. All right. Well, who was the first person to go to 0% interest rates, where you lower your interest of your debt to so you need to do that to such an extent to stimulate your economy. Um, no one's ever seen 0% or negative interest rates until 1995 in Japan. They were the pioneers of it. And we never did it until until the financial crisis. And so we went to 0% interest rates in 2009. Um, Treasuries at 0%. First time that ever happened was in Japan, 2019. First time it happened with us is 2016. First time it happened with us is 2019. So we're following in the footsteps of a nation that's had tremendous trouble. We went to 100% GDP debt in 2013. Japan did that in 99. They went to 200% debt to GDP in 2010. First time anyone ever did the quantitative easing deal was Japan, 2001. Um, we did it in 2009. If you remember, famously, Ben Bernanke swore that we would never monetize the debt. We'll never monetize the debt. They did it under his watch when in the financial crisis situation. When did the quantitative easing start moving away from just buying government debt and buying everything, any kind of debt, any market that's troubled, ETFs, other instruments, corporate bonds, like things like this. That happened in Japan in 2010. We never did that until when? The pandemic. We started doing that in 2020 to save the market, right? Which short term did. It saved the situation, but that's like just avoiding, that's like putting a stent in your artery that helps a little bit for a while, but that doesn't address the plaque buildup. Um, and then finally, when uh, Japan reached a level of debt ownership in 2022 where they literally own more of the debt they're issuing than other investors own. So you follow that? They're eating what they're eating their own refuse to the tune of more than half of the debt being issued. That's a real problem when you have to buy so much of your own debt that you're buying more than half. And all that leads to is the destruction that Dalio points out, which is these long cycles where everything blows up, currencies fail. If you were the reserve currency, you lose the reserve currency status. That makes it doubly worse, by the way. So, as bad as it's been in Japan, Japan's the number one owner of our debt. They're like, well, we're going to be okay because the United States is going to help bail us out. But when the United States fails, then the whole Bretton Woods post World War II structure of currency and debt, it all blows up. And that's, I think, this risk that's out there is, we talk about the U.S. Sneezes and the whole world gets a cold, right? You've heard of that expression. Um, so if the U.S. has a failure, or the U.S. can't sell their own debt, or the currency fails, or hyperinflates, or any of those things, then everyone else who's tied post World War II through that Western structure and system will also be greatly affected, if not as well. So I think that's the reality of our situation, despite a lot of euphoria. When President Trump was elected, we had what was called the Trump bump. But now with the saber rattling, we've had the Trump dump. And so we have this like correction in the markets. And there's sense to what's being said in the administration. Look, we've got to make tough choices. We're going to go through these rough patches. Yeah, it may just be that, a correction. But it could also be more of this unraveling. And I think that's what we can't just assume could never happen to us under this administration. Of course, if we're a Democrat, we probably think it's the worst thing ever, and we're definitely going to have inflation problem worse than under the prior administration. But that's all just opinion. So it's really about believers and Christians, the majority of which in the United States probably you could say are Republican, I would guess. Haven't looked at the polling. Um, and so we could get a false confidence, let's say, as Christians, that everything's going to be wonderful and we're going to have this golden age. And President Trump is God's chosen man for the job, and it's all going to work out wonderful. It's going to be like Reagan or better or what have you. I think that's part of what we're warning about is like maybe that is not the correct assumption to have. And we have to be humble in our approach to things. So hopefully
Greg,
that helps people prepare for that. Go ahead.
another question. Since Japan, we understand, and I remember you covered that very well. China being the second largest economy in the world, do we have any, and because it's a dictatorship in a communist country, do we have any real good understanding of what their situation is?
I don't have the numbers before us, but yes, they have a major problem too. They have copycatted a lot of the US styled capitalistic movements in their communistic rule. So once the markets were open in the 70s under Kissinger and Nixon, China has been mixing kind of their doctrine of control and communism with our doctrines or economics of capitalism. However, they've tried to do it in a way where they gatekeep and don't allow currency to leave the country. So it's been this weird dynamic, but they have the fuel for economic growth because they have had this billion person population that's gone from nothing to being consumers, copycatting like the United States' consumer movement. And in that, they also have used debt to bring in increase of capital flow, company capital formation, real estate development, governmental spending. They've used a lot of debt to try to get this growth, and just in that US style. And they have a major debt problem too. I don't have the numbers before us. I think they're probably lower than 100% GDP, but they have grown tremendously from almost no debt to like very high levels of debt very rapidly. And that's coincided with their growth to being the number one economy by purchase equivalent and number two economy in absolute terms, monetarily, like in dollars. It used to be Japan, but now that's China. But with that has come this tremendous debt burden. And so they have to service the debt. And one of the things that also Dalio brings up in this book, which is very wise, is that don't think wars are separate from economics. They're tied together. So if a country gets into a problem, they will go to war to solve their problem. We see that in Russia, for example. And so we see this as the sanctions war versus what their movements are going west from Russia. So if China need be to sustain their debt, by the way, they've accumulated a lot of other assets like gold to try to be a backstop to that or a reserve to that. But if they need be and they want to take the Philippines, well, hey, why not? We've got the military. Let's just move on in. We'll get their resources. We'll get their benefits to counterbalance our debt and servicing our debt. So the prospect of war is related to the economics, and there's cases that can be made about how people use war to get rich, to finance wars is the best banking going. That's kind of the the Rothschild philosophy. Sometimes people describe it that way in Europe of funding wars. So yeah, it's tied together for sure.
So it's around the world, whether you go to South America and, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico,
Oh
uh,
yeah, all the
Africa.
developing
I mean, I'm
countries.
sure the whole continent
Yep,
of Africa. Yeah.
all of the countries, all the major economies, top 30, I believe, also have these debt issues.
Hmm.
And if you remember, there was the South American debt crisis of the 70s where they took on all the debt and they couldn't service it, and it blew up and it almost sank Citibank for a while. So yes, there's debt at high levels all throughout the earth, and it's kind of strange. The whole world is like indebted to one another, which is weird because it's like we're all slaves to this debt, and we want the debt to be successful in selling more of it. So we want to, reward investors with more interest, but it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy and a self-feeding prophecy as all the nations of the world are increasing in their debt.
Yeah. So if they're all doing that, the top 35 economies or top 40 economies, we're really heading toward Armageddon here because they're not going to solve their problems any more than we're solving our problems.
Yeah, and it's going to head to war, and that's kind of what Dalio's hinting at. If we don't, he puts it as if we don't have a beautiful deleveraging, we're going to end up blowing up. That'll precipitate wars. He was essentially saying that's what happened in World War One and Two, and that'll happen again. So yes, that will create a tremendous instability, and that's part of his warning. It's like we're headed that direction. Like if something doesn't change. And if you walk through his solution, he has proposed solutions. There's three levers you can use to reduce this deficit. One is your tax structure and system and bringing in taxes. The other is controlling your spending, and the other is your interest rates in your central bank. So his prescription is, well, you can move those three levers, but if you move any one too hard, it affects everything else and it becomes counterproductive. You can't do it. It's too much stress on the system. So you need a little bit of each. And what he's proposing, and I think the question is this realistic? Is, hey, if we can be disciplined and really cut the spending, at the same time we convince the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low, then that will help us reduce the deficit. It's like, that's true mechanically, but is it reality politically and practically? So how do you do that, especially if you have an inflation problem? So if we have the stubborn inflation that hasn't gone away, how are you going to convince the Fed to lower rates, let's say artificially, when you have an inflation problem? Because your inflation grows when you do that. So it's kind of like they're opposite each other.
Mm.
So if and then how are we going to convince politically the will to cut the spending? So his beautiful deleveraging is essentially like, let's get the Fed to just go along with this and let's just be good about cutting our spending. And if we do that, we can get out of this. And I think that's true, or that potentially is true. But is there the will to do that? And then how do you solve that inflation interest rate issue? Because that's the one that's like impossible to solve for. As we know, if you have strong inflation, you have to raise interest rates to be able to cut inflation. When you have a fiat currency structure like we do, where the money only is backed by the credit of the United States, the ability to tax, the ability to continue, the ability to not blow up. That's what that's based on.
Hmm.
That's our dilemma. And that's why you're like, whoa, the guy who sees this the clearest and is being the clearest about delivering the message essentially has the solution, but it's more a theoretical solution. It's not a reality solution. So what does that mean for us? I think that's something to pray about and say, okay, we're in this situation. We remain vigilant. How do we pray? How do we act? How do we prepare? And let's just make sure we're not being ignorant to it and saying everything's going to be fine. We're invincible with this leader or that leader. I think that's really the message I think for Christians who are watching this is don't just count on everything being okay, because if we're following the warning and the biblical pattern and the natural warning and the natural pattern, that may be rose-colored glasses that we're wearing. So it's a matter of looking at it that way and acting accordingly. All right. Anyone else want to come in here? A question or like a comment or an observation, a disagreement. Yeah, I don't agree because we want to have all that here. An agreement because whatever people want to chime in here. Jackie,
Greg,
you.
yeah,
Yes,
good morning.
see you. Good morning.
So he recommends to cut the interest rate, cut spending. What about taxes? What does he say about taxes?
When you say he, you mean the administration, President Trump?
No, you were talking about Dalio and his.
Oh, Dalio. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
On the tax front, he really was saying he was not advocating to move that lever as much as the other two levers. So I haven't read more, and I've got to dig into it more. He's recommending all three levers. I think he's saying like reducing taxes. He's not. Well, that's a good point. He's not making a stance on that one because you can, like, during the Clinton administration, the tax levels, the rates went up, and that did actually help reduce the deficit. But if you're a Laffer curve person, you say, let's cut the taxes, grow the economy, and that'll make up for it. I think the data shows that actually it makes up for it not on an absolute basis, but on a relative basis. So you get a little bit of a coming back. If I'm remembering the numbers, according to Dalio's historical analysis, when taxes are cut, you recover approximately 16% of that back through growth in the economy. So, as far as I know, Dalio is not really talking about that lever too much, but we could dig into his book more and find out. He's saying use all three levers. Those are the three levers we have, but he was really saying more. Let's just convince the Fed to lower interest rates at the same time as being austere and being disciplined and cutting the spending. I think that's the premise. I may not be 100% on that.
And President Trump is suggesting to cut taxes. That's what he wants to do.
Yeah, so
Doesn't
earlier that we were talking about that the administration is doing the Doge, right? So that's cutting the spending. But if you lower the taxes or re-up the tax cuts of 2017, that costs you something in terms of your revenue. So that increases the deficit. So if we save a lot of money but then give it back through tax cuts, we net we may have the same deficit. So that's the struggle. That's the warning. Is that there's again like Dalio, the administration has, and my dad was highlighting this earlier, they want to accomplish reducing the deficit, but they've made campaign promises of cutting more taxes, like taxes on tips, taxes on Social Security, which then costs you by increasing the deficit. You get some of it back through growth in GDP, but not all of it. And I think Dalio's analysis was 16% of that comes back to you. So does that make sense? It's like, I think the hope is there. Hey, if we're good about efficiency, waste, and fraud, and we're cutting bureaucracy and we're cutting our spending, that helps reduce the deficit. But we want these tax cuts to stimulate economic growth. Well, that increases the deficit. So if you increase the deficit while you lowered the deficit, you net may be neutral. And then depending on what the Federal Reserve is doing with interest rates, it can be worse because if you have, so here's another part of the analysis. The average, so Dalio spoke about rolling over government debt. When you issue a 10-year bond, and that's the typical treasury, right? 10-year treasury. I'm sure you've heard that. When you buy that, you effectively have the debt locked in for 10 years. At the end of 10 years, it expires. So if you haven't paid that off, you have to replace it by issuing more debt. That's called a rollover. So this debt is expiring. We roll it into new debt, which means we have to issue new debt on top of issuing more debt. So rollover is a risk. If you don't have people buying that debt, interest rates go up. Or the central bank has to print money to buy it, which is another risk to the equation. So I think that the average interest cost on our total debt has gone up the past 3 years. And if I remember the numbers right, it was like 2.5% the average interest cost for all of our debt. With an average duration, which means how quickly 100% of the debt rolls over, is like 6 years. So every 6 years, you got to replace all of your debt unless you paid it off. And so it went from 2.5 to 3.5, and we're now on a trajectory, according to the existing yield curve. Long-term treasuries are 4.5%. So 2.5 to 3.5 to 4.5. That's almost a doubling of our interest expense. So the interest expense today is greater than the defense budget. It's nearing to $1 trillion. And if you double that, we have a problem because then there's so much interest that has to be paid that adds to your deficit. So those three levers, interest rates, they're going up, taxes, they're going down. Those two things add to deficits. And the third thing is your spending. Well, Doge should reduce spending, so that's a net reversal of the other two. But the question is, where do we end up at the end of 4 years when we look at the historical record? And when in the first President Trump's first administration, the deficits kept going. The deficits were large. You can argue for why that happened, but it just happened. So it's like you have the best laid plans, but then what actually happened? Um, I think we have the best laid plans right now, but if you can't achieve that for these reasons we're all talking about, what will the reality be? And then are you back to the heart attack that Dalio is warning about? I think that's kind of the crux of the situation that we're in.
Greg, isn't the
Yes.
most important thing then to really grow the economy to above 3% a year?
No, because that's not the biggest lever. It's a consequence of things. So people often talk about the way you get out of the debt problem is you grow your economy, you grow your way out of it. The risk is while you're trying to grow your economy, you're adding to the deficit and you're going into the point of no return that Dalio is saying. So let's say we could get 5% GDP growth, but in order to do that, we have to increase our deficits or at least keep the deficits going. What he's saying is even if you have 5% growth in GDP, you're going to have a heart attack. And then you won't have 5% growth. You're going to have contraction. You're going to reverse those gains. So you could always increase the economy by borrowing money, right? That's like I borrow and I spend. It's just like a household. But the trick is like, can you grow the economy while being fiscally austere, while holding taxes or not? Let's just say holding taxes, so you still get your tax revenue coming in, and your inflation issues are contained so that your interest rates can remain lower. That's really the way out. So it's a bit of what do you want to say? A bit of a fallacy to say growing the economy is the way out. Because if you grow your economy while increasing your debt, it's not a way out. You have to grow the economy to some extent while you're really buckling down and being disciplined about your spending, while you're continuing to have taxes coming in. That's the only way to deal with it. And that is a
Has
very
that ever has that ever
long
happened though?
process. And again, Dalio's saying it's never happened. It ends up blowing up economies and changing the world order, and then we have war, and then everything resets. And that's what led to this growth that we're having now. World War II was the setup. Bretton Woods was the vehicle. Reconstruction of Europe was part of it. That developed this US dollar-led economic long-term cycle. He's saying all of his data shows we're at the end of that cycle. And historically, that's around this 80-year period. He said it's plus or minus 25 years, but then you look at all these indicators, and the indicators are showing flashing red. Like if you don't do anything, if we continue on this course within 3 years, the whole thing is going to just go blow up. That's essentially his conclusion. Doesn't mean it's right. It's just like it's another piece of information, but it's someone who's educated in this, and that's what his focus has been his whole life, creating the biggest hedge fund in the world.
Something kind of interesting that's been floating around a little bit about how to use the like Doge cuts is there was something said about a Doge dividend, which is like which is kind of hilarious, but the sentiment is like a $5,000 stimulus check. And the numbers there are reflective of, I think it's 20%, using 20% of what was cut and just giving it back to people, which it's similar to tax cuts, but it's different. Because I mean, $5,000, I think the median income in the United States is like $40,000 a year. And so you're talking about, an eighth of people's income. If you're self-employed, you're paying a fifth of your income in taxes. And so it's like that would experience a lot like a tax cut. But
it would
you would,
stimulate the economy for sure, but
yeah,
it's going to increase the deficit. That's the issue with it.
And so then the other idea is like another 20% would go towards like cutting deficit, would go towards debt. I mean, they have a different ideas of how the breakdown could go, but it's like instead of just doing one, it's like, all right, we're going to use this to like give money back and stimulate and like pay off debt. So it's like kind of a multiple front approach. That
Yeah,
is
so
not at all promised, but it's an idea.
right, so you're bringing up an idea. It's a popular idea, right? Hey, let's give the money back to the people. We've overtaxed them. Let's give it back. That sounds good. That sounds smart even. But if you have debt that you have outstanding while you're doing that and that's increasing, it's kind of like a false giving back. Hey, we're giving this back to you, but your kids and everybody else are going to owe an even bigger bar tab. Like, here's a free beer, but we put it on your tab. And I think that's not wise. It's popular, but it's not wise. It's a little bit like we've seen President Trump talk about the what does he call it? The sovereign wealth fund. Okay, so all these countries that don't have as much debt, like the oil producing Arab nations that are part of OPEC, they have these sovereign wealth funds because they have surpluses from all of their um, trade surpluses. We have all this oil. We're selling it to everybody around the world. We're getting rich. What are we going to do with our riches? Let's have a sovereign wealth fund. Let's invest it all over the world in these financial markets, and we'll get a great return. So President Trump sees that, and the administration, they're like, we should have a sovereign wealth fund. We're the greatest nation on earth. Why don't we have one? We could be making all this money too. But think about that. If you create a sovereign wealth fund and you're funding it through debt, you're basically gambling the future tax receipts of the country on the financial markets. That's essentially what you're doing. That's different than how the sovereign wealth funds got created. That's like having a leveraged hedge fund inside of the government. And is that wise? I don't think it is. I think because when you're funding it all through debt, it's like, watch out. You're all you're doing is risking blowing up or having that heart attack even quicker and even bigger, um, if you create such a sovereign wealth fund. So some of these ideas are like they sound pretty good, but when you really get underneath it and you realize it's all going to add to the deficit and increase the debt, we're not paying that down. We're actually increasing the debt to carve out some money to buy some assets to have this sovereign wealth fund. Is that wise? Um, I think, like, even in my own personal experience and testimony, going through running out of money and running into these debt problems, it just you realize that the assumption of I'll have enough income to service this debt is a presumption. And if we presume incorrectly, it doesn't work. Um, and in our case, in our testimony, it's like God took us through that to show us don't trust in money coming and saving you, trust in me. I think the nation could be facing a similar situation. Don't trust in your money, your horses, and your chariots. Trust in me. If you have a debt problem in a crisis like Dalio's warning about, how will you respond to it? Because if you trust me, I can make a way. But if you go your own way, it's the path of destruction. And that is the biblical history. That is this repeat rising and falling of nations and empires. And I think we're facing that right now. Like we may be very well in that same kind of situation. Like when Dalio's warning, when we start issuing debt just to pay the old debt and pay the interest on the old debt, that is the point of no return. Like in every example he's ever seen historically, once you are in that zone, it's all over. And then it's a question of when does a heart attack come? Um, and then it's a question of how do we respond? Other comments, thoughts, alternative perspectives, disagreements, welcome, agreements, testimonies. What else, guys? What do you think? Is Dalio onto something here? Any other questions about the governmental debt issue? I mean, this risks the whole world's economy because we're the reserve currency. I think that's the other wrinkle here it's not just whether the United States will get through this well or have a crisis. It's really whatever happens with us is going to impact the world. So, any thoughts there? The rising and falling of nations. That's part of that warning letter we're sending, by the way, is like is sort of looking back at empires like the Roman Empire. What were some of the there's been some Christian scholars who've written about this and some other people who have looked at it and like what happened in Rome and where did things like get so decadent, get so, it's like if you watch the movie Gladiator 2, it's like it's kind of all in that movie, like how, you know, sexuality was affected, how the culture was affected, how everything was the bloodthirsty sport. Um, essentially this letter is saying we're following those same patterns. Sodom and Gomorrah was another one where the scriptures say the greed of Sodom and Gomorrah was potentially even the worse issue than just the sexual immorality. It was the greed and the carefree attitude and just being selfish. Joel, go for it.
I guess one question is like, aside from America, this being a potentially global um, issue, what do we see as far as other nations' safeguards? Kind of, I mean, the world's seeing the same thing that we're seeing, like none of us are in government, none of us are, we don't we don't have Doge access to information, right? But like we're seeing these things, so it's like the rest of the world must be not putting all their eggs in one basket. So I'm kind of curious what you see in terms of, global safeguards.
I think the reality is everyone has put their eggs in our basket hoping for our riches, which is to say, go into further debt to simulate growth and worry about the consequences afterwards. So that's the pattern we were talking about earlier, Joel, this pattern of globally how's that increased over time. Dalio's warning is saying we were at unprecedented debt levels everywhere in the world. China, Japan, Europe, us, developing nations. It's not only unprecedented levels on absolute terms, it's unprecedented on any relative measure. So compared with GDP, for example. So the whole rest of the world has followed in that pattern. And the limits of that are some of the nations like Russia no longer have access to that kind of credit. So they're turning to alternative economic models like the hard cash of sneaking out oil and selling it, under false auspices or taking a haircut, things like that. Turning to hard currency, China building up gold reserves. Everyone's still borrowing whatever they can, and investors will let them get away with because everyone sees that as the path to success and growth post World War II, like the United States has experienced. So I think it's a follow in the footsteps. And one of the points that Dalio makes is that historically this always ends up in war, because when you blow up the currency, you end up entering into war for your interests. And one of the things, like for example, Warren Buffett has kind of under the rug a little bit said, "Hey, uh, make no mistake, tariffs are uh, an act of war." That's what he said. So that's part of this dynamic of the tariffs. Like we have, I think President Trump and the administration has their intentions. We're getting ripped off. We got to stop getting ripped off. But the issue is like, how will that be seen geopolitically? And is it an act of war? Is it a quasi act of war? You may have even seen like PM Trudeau was commenting on that. Is this an act of war against Canada? Oh no, we love Americans. The reason we're booing them is not because we don't love them. It's because of the tariffs. And it's like, really, like I think people are probably more emotional than just over the tariff. Like it's like this is an act of war. So I think this is one of the concerns, one of the situations at hand. Jackie, go ahead.
It is an act of war. And I saw the reaction from the ambassador, the Chinese ambassador, I think, to the United States. He said that the United States wants a war on tariffs, we will respond. Does the United States wants a war on, he mentioned three things, and he said we will go to war if we have to. So I believe it's been seen as an act of war, and even the opposition leader in Canada, who I think he's going to be the new prime minister as long as as soon as they open the parliament again. Um, he said he was very upset with Trump, and he said, "Hey, I understand that Trudeau and the liberal administration hasn't done anything to stop fentanyl from coming to the United States, but he was saying this is not a way to respond." So I think it's being seen like that. My concern mainly, Greg, is as you mentioned before, these countries in the Middle East that are so wealthy, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, UAE, and all these countries. What about the debt? Do they have debt? Or they have so much money and they are the ones who are going to end up controlling everything? And that's the way we're seeing things. It's just this marriage between communism and Islamism that is so concerning. And they're thinking about opening, these corridors that are to control the food, to control the economy, to control everything, control speech, control everything. And they are going to be the ones running it. That's my biggest concern, because I think that's where we're going to see the Antichrist and everything that comes with it.
Yeah, I think
Something
go
to
ahead.
respond to that. I think there's like a different way of engaging with debt. Like you can engage with debt nationally um, by using your surplus and leveraging it so that you can have a bigger impact in the market. Um, and we probably see a lot of that with these other countries, but also you see that with like individual players. So it's like you'll end up with these people who, have have a hand in sovereign wealth, who have family resources and all these things, who are using these debt resources just so they can make that much more money. But then what ends up happening is when you have a leveraged position and that thing tanks, you also have like a leveraged debt now. Like that debt is now multiplied because it didn't go the way that you thought it was going to go. Um, and something to add about war. I mean, after World War II, we just straight up as a global community were like, we're not going to recognize, the takeover of another country by military force as like legitimate or valid. And so like then over the years, like directly affirmed like the legality globally of soft takeover of countries, of using, you know, propaganda influence and, using, you know, international um, international groups to do things in other countries that like could topple governments. Like we as a global community were like, yeah, you can covertly topple a government, but you can't do it with military force anymore. And so when that that bar is lowered, um, or when that bar is changed, I guess you could say that bar is raised. You raise the bar for what determines the sovereignty of a country. When you raise that bar, you're also raising the bar of what is considered war and like an act of war and what is considered like an attempt at government takeover from one country to another, an attempt at overcoming the sovereignty of another space. Um, so it's like in in the redefining of things after World War II, like this is 100% an act of war.
Well, yeah, I hear you, Joel, but they are doing it. They are not doing it not by an act of war, but they are doing it by an act of influencing the universities. And we're looking
Yeah,
at the United States. That's exactly what happened. They have
exactly.
taken control over the curriculum of the universities, over the minds of our young people, and they are doing it very quietly, slowly but surely, and that's very concerning.
Well,
Qatar
that's a
with
part of
Colombia and all of that. So
that's a
they are
part of
doing
that.
it without even shooting one bullet.
That's a
And
part of that soft takeover stuff that has like been legitimized. And like that's a part of why, when I was like, I'm like, why is Elon Musk like running stuff in Washington? Like, how did this happen? It's like, oh, because like there was a censorship attempt in our country, and he was like, oh, I'm gonna just like buy this platform and let people say whatever they want on it because in other countries we influence people through these different media outlets, and we've redefined democracy as the consensus of institutions rather than the consensus of individuals. So you influence those institutions and you can you know democracy your way into whatever you want.
but I'm
Right.
really concerned about these Islamist jihadist countries. All of them are going to be the same scene. Let's look at what is happening with Syria. The guy has a suit on and he trimmed his beard, and everybody was like, oh, he's a new person. No, it's the same mentality behind a suit. And look what is happening. So I'm very concerned about, and I would like to hear, Greg, what do you
Sure.
think about these countries that have so much money and very little debt?
Right. So just a few things to note here, addressing that question first. Saudi Arabia and the other nations are very wealthy, but they have been adding debt. So I just looked up Saudi Arabia's development called the Line. That's a 100-mile, huge, unprecedented real estate development. It's modeled after what the UAE has done. They have gone into a lot of debt to create that. So it's interesting. And then what Joel pointed out is true too. The Saudi Arabian countries having a sovereign wealth fund have gone into leveraged investments, which also is using debt. So in their case, they have a surplus, but they're adding debt to fuel their growth and development. Now, if that backfires, they have their wealth to fall back on. That's so they are at the moment on a net surplus, I believe. I don't think they're, I'll take a look at it and do the analysis. But as soon as you get into leveraged finance operations in a sovereign wealth fund, like a hedge fund does, you're using typically like a 10 times up to a 10 times leveraged ratio, which means if you have a loss, like I don't know if you remember, Bill Wong had this loss, and then Credit Suisse almost failed, and other Wall Street firms almost failed because the instruments where they were providing the debt also failed. And so when he failed in the trades, Bill Wong was a Christian hedge fund manager that failed and had some troubles. And that almost wiped out like a corner of Wall Street. So you have that as a dynamic. Now, putting it aside, I think the the issue with Saudi Arabia and the Arab nations, like you're saying, it's definitely an issue, is they're going to export their values as they have wealth, as they have success, as they have growth. So are those Christian values? They're not. That should be of concern for sure. What is going on a little bit though is there's some talk all the way of peace and prosperity, peace and prosperity. So one of my great concerns is even Prime Minister Netanyahu as well as the United States, is saying peace and prosperity. Let's create these trade routes between the Saudi Arabian nations, sorry, the Middle Eastern Arab nations, and us, and everyone get along so we can just get rich, wealthy, have prosperity. Let's have Gaza turned into the um, Israeli Riviera. And so the issue is when you're saying peace and prosperity, but it's not quite peace and prosperity because will we be guaranteed of this golden age? We were making the discussion earlier. I'm sorry, not necessarily. In our pride and hubris, though, we might convince ourselves of that. And then we can also pretend these tariff dealings and people are ripping us off. We're going to renegotiate. We could pretend that that's not an act of war and it's all about peace and prosperity. But it's it's America first action, if you want to call it that. I mean, so here's the contrast. Like post World War II, that created all this prosperity, we helped rebuild and reconstruct Europe out of generosity. We were saying we want to give, take advantage of this to help you be restored. And some of those structures, like NATO and others, and common defense and rebuilding, continued on until this day. And it's now being painted as we're being ripped off. Well, were we being ripped off when Truman was being generous and seeing Israel formed and then rebuilding Europe and lending to Japan and helping rebuild the whole world? We were being ripped off in a sense because we were paying for it, but that was a good thing. That was considered good. I think part of that generosity and that spirit of helping other nations probably contributed to our blessing and economic growth. So that's one of the questions is, are we really entering into this peace and prosperity, or is it something else? Because we're trying to have our cake and eat it too in a lot of ways. Like we want the golden age, we want peace and prosperity, but we want to rattle the sabers. We want to stop getting ripped off. We want this. We want this. Is it realistic to achieve all of that? I think that's a big question. Greg, you've been patiently waiting. Go for it, my friend.
Uh, I mean, yeah. I just wanted to share one thing. One of the rumors that was going on around in the WSB community. Some of the greatest minds that are on this earth is that Trump was going to try to use tariffs as a way to manipulate J-Pow into lowering interest rates. The idea is that the tariffs cause inflation. Uh, he'll be forced to aim for his, they want 2% inflation, and that we know that Trump was always giving, Jerome Powell a hard time, trying to force his hand to lower interest rates.
Right. He
And
wanted Powell to lower interest rates to help the economy.
and with tariffs, that might be a way to manipulate him, in an indirect way. But that's the rumor that was floated around.
One counterpoint to that rumor is that if tariffs drive inflation, inflation increases interest rates. So they work in tandem. So it's hard to have inflation while you're lowering your interest rates. Just
Yeah.
something to consider.
Like I said, though, this is WSB. Right.
Okay. Yeah. So it's like that's another theory, another position of postulate, a guess as to what's going on about. There's no doubt there's always been lobbying for the Fed to pretty much lower interest rates. I don't think there's ever been any lobbying politically for let's increase interest rates and choke us. It's always that push for lower it, lower it. And lower interest rates, as Ray Dalio has said, that helps you reduce your deficit because you're paying less for the debt. It can help you reduce the debt. And that's true, but the issue is inflation. And when you have inflation, like this stubborn 3% inflation we have, you can't really lower your interest rates below 3% because if you do, you create a distortion and then that can choke off the economy. It can cause more inflation, essentially. That's what'll happen. And then you can even get stagflation. Stagflation is where your economy is shrinking, yet you still have this stubborn inflation. That's like one of the worst vectors. That and a deflation. Deflation is very bad too. That's what Japan has seen. Jackie and Joel, back to you. Any other thoughts, comments?
No.
I think that notion of like using tariffs to kind of um, strong arm towards, reducing interest rates. Um, I think that is an interesting idea. Like, but it basically what it takes is you anger and upset enough other nations. It's a gamble, right? So you anger and upset enough other nations such that, and then you point the finger, right? You say, hey, well, if this wasn't our situation, which is out of our hands, you know, we wouldn't be doing this. So, you leave it at that, right? And it's like, hey, if you guys can do something about this, like we won't have to have tariffs. Then what you end up doing is you end up, pegging these other nations against these debt holders.
It's a
Um,
blame game.
yeah, it's a blame game that could be effective, but it's also a gamble. It's a blame gamble where it's like, if I make somebody mad and be like, hey, you're mad at me because, you know, Tommy is hitting me in a pressure point that's making me swing my arm and it's slapping you, or like beat up Tommy. Like, you know, some people
Yeah.
might beat up you and Tommy. You know what I mean? It's not it's not just Tommy that's getting hit.
For one thing, it's not really Christ-like. It's not a death to self. It's like a let's taunt and punch back. But uh, maybe more interestingly is this: having your cake and eat it too. Let's think about this. So it sounds good, right? Like we're getting ripped off. We gotta level the playing field. So we're gonna do this tariff thing. There's, to one level that makes some sense. But here's the problem. The way we created our economic power was through this open idea of a US led free market around the world. So we had the globalization of a US dollar in free trade. And as we had free trade and we were inviting every nation in the world into free trade, we weren't thinking about are we getting ripped off? We were thinking about if we're all open and transparent, we're all going to grow and be blessed and prosper. That was the approach. We got taken advantage of later by other nations like China for that approach. So maybe somewhat naive. But before we got to that, we reaped the benefit of this exporting and globalizing free trade with no tariffs, low tariffs, that we were the best, we were one of the greatest beneficiaries. And one of the ways, and probably the number one way we were able to grow our economy was through growing productivity. And how did we get that? We exported jobs to the nations that had lower labor costs. So if we have no tariff barriers and China can build everything for us, that's great because then we can have more value added jobs here. Let China do the menial stuff. We get cheap goods. Our economy expands. Inflation is lowered because the costs are lower. It's cheaper to buy stuff from China than make it in America. We reaped the benefit of all that. We accumulated the growth of all of that. So it's a little bit having your cake and eat it too to now turn around and say, we're getting ripped off and put all the tariffs back. Because what we're doing is we're cutting off the very thing we espoused, the free trade, the globalization, right? We're not focused on globalization. We are focused on America first. But if you're America first, you're almost building in a contraction economically. because now you're not going to have lower labor costs as you repatriate jobs, which is one of the prime objectives of these tariffs. Let's build in America again, right? That sounds good. It is good. Here's the problem. No one in America wants to pay 10 times as much for all the American paid goods. And if we do, we're going to have huge inflation problems, right? So this is why you can't necessarily have your cake and eat it too. We're going to do the tariffs. We're getting ripped off. We're going to renegotiate these great deals. We're going to bring jobs back to America, but we're going to keep inflation down and keep interest rates down. And we're going to, we're going to pay down the deficit too.
And keep
That's
wages high.
yeah, that is really not, I don't think that's realistic. I think we enjoyed all the benefits of helping the world and lowering those barriers and rebuilding Europe and Asia. Post World War II, we exported our dollars. We started getting taken advantage of, by the way, with the gold standard for doing that. And Nixon had to stop that because, kind of like a precedent to the America First stuff, if we didn't do that, we were going to lose all the gold. Like we were going to run out of gold and it wouldn't work anymore. So we kind of made that compromise and continued to open the markets. But is it realistic to repatriate these jobs through the tariff structures and wars while at the same time having all these benefits of the golden age? I'm not sure that's realistic. So you got to choose, right? And Americans could already buy products made in America. They just have to pay a lot more. I'm a surfer and a kite surfer. A kite that's made in China would say cost $1,000. I was told by a person who repairs such kites that if that kite was built from scratch in America, it would cost $10,000. No one would buy them because no one could afford them. So what happens? Like how do we deal with that? Like we've enjoyed these benefits for so long, we've gotten used to them. What do we do? Like the debt, this is a paradox. It's not easily dealt with. And I think that's part of our challenge that we face and we need to pray into is like, is it realistic to have our cake and eat it too? By the force of, just politics or the force of hoping for the best? Or is the real key to repent and continue to turn back to God in a much greater fashion, humbling ourselves and trusting in Him? Because I think the path of rose-colored glasses leads to Ray Dalio's heart attack, where we think we can just be self-oriented and it's okay. I think that's one of the things we're facing as a country. I think it's, being patriotic is good and there's a positivity to it. But if it's I want it all, I want it my way, it's up to me, I'm from New York, the song, how that goes. Um, is that prideful and is that going to fail? And has that happened in other empires and nations?
It has happened, and we saw it with Israel, and we saw that 9/11. We're gonna rebuild. We're gonna rebuild, and we're gonna do it on our own terms, and we're gonna be okay. And that's pride, and we get what we get as a result of it. So I think it's repentance and going back to the Lord. It's saying we don't know what to do. We are against the,
Need help.
in between the sword and the war. We are in between the Egyptians and the Red Sea. We don't know what to do.
Yeah. And I think to me, it's very useful to look at Jonathan Cahn's warnings, his prophetic warnings for the United States. He's like a messianic prophet to the U.S. He wrote in the book, The Harbinger, the U.S. is following the pattern of Israel. Let's look at Isaiah 9, verses 10 and others. Look at these parallels. It's incredible, these parallels. What happened during 9/11, for example. And so if we understand that, it's like Israel was God's chosen people and nation, but that was conditioned upon the fact that they wouldn't turn away from God, because God can't just say, yes, I bless disobedience. I bless worshiping of other gods. I bless you just because. It's not like that. So if Israel had to heed the warning and didn't, that led to their destruction or the scattering of the 10 tribes. Um, how much greater for us? Like, we can't be arrogant about that. We have to heed the warnings. And I think that this pattern that Khan has established, he talks about President Trump being a hero like Jehu was in the Bible, used to tear down Jezebel and Baal, but continued in arrogance and pride and worshiping of the golden calf. That was Jehu's downfall and ultimately Israel's downfall. Are we repeating the same pattern? Are we being warned? Do we need to be careful with, it's like we need to tear down false gods, and that's happening, right? We're having some of that happening right now in the US, and this administration is tearing down some gods and idols, some Jezebelian influences, no doubt about it. But if we're all about self and golden calves and great prosperity, even without repenting in the other areas of sexual immorality, shedding innocent blood, and greed, you know, is that enough? And I think that's for us, like the key for me. It's the key prayer point. Like, let's press in. Can we as the church model and example what it means to fully turn back to God instead of just trusting in the systems, trusting in this administration, trusting in horses and chariots? It's like, how can we turn back to God and really complete the assignment of repentance and have the fruits of repentance? Anybody else as we close here, top of the hour? Jackie, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying I agree with you. I agree. You can, we have seen it before. You can change laws. You can do all kind of take legislative action, but if you don't change hearts, it's like building without the law. It's in vain we're building if it's not one building. It's changing hearts the most important thing.
Something that's interesting that is kind of in line with what you're talking about, that like a hard don't do that from the Lord. Um, but it's like the concept of like heart-based um not gerrymandering, when district mandering, poll mandering,
That's
where
gerrymandering.
yeah, gerrymandering. I said gerrymandering, like faith-based or really heart-based gerrymandering, which is like what we do in this country to get, you know, to get certain people elected, that we do to get certain things passed, is like you reorganize a district so that, some numbers are diluted and, others become more predominant. But it's like the flip side version of that, because that's a manipulation, right? But then like the other side of that is like, oh, like what would it mean to like proselytize a district? What would it mean to, um, you know, completely evangelize a space such that the person that's in office is in covenant to be a representation of those people. And like, you break covenant, you get kicked out. But that's an idea, right? Which is already what we're called to do, right? We're called to tell everybody about the good news of the kingdom and to be a part
Yeah.
of expanding it. So,
Instead of using
yeah.
political power for our own gain, we use it for our own loss for the sake of the gospel. Like, I think that's a way of saying it, which is the path of humility. I think that's right. It's like I look at presidents like Harry Truman, post World War II, President Eisenhower. They weren't perfect people, but they had a generous heart of like being, hey, come, we want to be generous. We want to help you. We want to help rebuild Europe. We want to help form Israel. We want to use our political power to help people, not our political power to gain an advantage for ourselves. I think having that heart is really a good heart to have. Um, and we're not in we're I don't think we're in that situation right now. I mean, I think there's aspects like President Trump supports Israel, as did Harry Truman. But are we in it to win it for ourselves, or are we in it to be a blessing to others, even if we get taken advantage of and give it away? I think that's kind of a question out there. And
Something to add to that though is I think there is a certain measure of um, like prerequisites to that giving away of self, um, that like is for Christ's sake, right? And I think that there's a really big difference of like giving, like what we did as a nation. We didn't give because we wanted the world to know the generosity of Christ. We did it because we thought it would make everyone rich. And so when you do something like that, that like is reflective of, you know, a Christian value, but like is not rooted in like with those intentions, right? The intentions were to gain wealth, not to, you know, show like demonstrate the kingdom of God. And so I think there becomes a challenge of like, do we do that again? And the answer very realistically could be yes if it's to proclaim the gospel, and no if it's to pursue wealth. And so it's like you can have you can have both things be righteous, I think. But it's a matter of, you know, why we're doing it, what's leading that, and what's
yeah,
driving
what's our
that. And
motivation?
yeah,
I would contend, maybe agree, disagree, that Truman and Eisenhower weren't looking to get America rich. They were looking to do what was right in the face of stopping evil in World War II. And the rebuilding was more of a, you're destroyed, we can help you, we want to help you. I think we ultimately did profit from that, right? It was a good thing. But, was that heart more like Christ if it wasn't explicitly like that? I think partly yes, partly no. When we rebuilt Japan, we did not rebuild it with we really were absent rebuilding it with the faith of Christianity or the faith in Christ. That's one of the great missed opportunities. Like, we didn't really bring in missionaries into Japan. We didn't really we gave them kind of this almost Western Christian market set or free market ideas instead of command and control of the emperor. But we didn't bring the salt and light with that. So that's an example of what you're saying, which is like we taught them how to prosper using Christian principles, but we didn't teach them, we didn't bring the gospel. Um, but now we're even in a more exaggerated place as time went on, where it's becoming more and more about what do we get out of this rather than what can we sow into it. And I think that's definitely a struggle. Like, look, we have to do these things. We got to cut bureaucracy. Can't just spend into oblivion. We don't want to export influencing the other nations with things that are certainly not the gospel. They're the opposite of that. So that's all good. Like, we got to have security and borders so we don't allow evil to slip in, drugs to slip in, sex trafficking to slip in. So these things are all positive. But again, is it unto the Lord or is it unto self? And is it unto our own prosperity or is it unto the sacrifice that Jesus is saying? Uh, when you follow me, you're going to have to take up your cross and follow me. So I think that's what you're contending. We can take up our cross and follow God by doing these things and doing good and helping people in that way. But of course, we've ended up in this place where we're exporting our cultural craziness with our resources, and that's no good. So, but can we turn it around? Can we go back to mission setting? I think the Haystack Revival was an example of that. The student volunteer movement was an example of that. Out of the revivals of the Second Great Awakening, we were doing that. We were like sending missionaries around the world. So
Greg,
can
I'm
we
in
get
the
back to that?
waiting room. Sorry, I'm in the waiting room with another name. Would you let me in? It's my computer trying to get in.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I think I saw that there was, if you want to come back in, let me know. All right. So
Yeah, if you can allow me to get in the
I don't
computer,
have
my
a,
name.
I don't currently have someone trying to get in. So if you want to try to do that again.
Oh, okay, because it says that I'm in the waiting room. Okay, let me try
Oh,
it again.
sorry. Desperantino. I got it. Yep.
Thank you.
I was wondering if that was a desperado. Okay, here we go.
That's Despertando is awakening
What is
in
you're a translator. What's despertanto mean?
awakening.
Ah,
Despertando is in
that is
English.
not a
Yeah.
desperado. That's an awakening.
Yes. Okay. I want to make some comments, but let me get in my computer.
Please go for it. And also, Jackie, while you prepare for that, would you close us in prayer today too? Pray for the U.S.
Sure. Sure. Thank you. Yeah, no, we were talking about what you said and Joel said. I was reminded of what happened with Israel and so-called Palestinians. When they, in 2008, 2005, when they gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians and people started investing there.
Hmm.
And, the left in Israel, which is very different from the left in Latin America, they thought, okay, we're going to give them a good place. We're going to give them good jobs. They're going to have good money. They're going to have everything that they need. Everything is going to be okay because that's what people want. They just want a roof and they want to have the money to spend and they want to have, opportunities. Well, the reality is different because of the um, thinking is different. And we just saw that when, with October 7th. So I think, as you were saying, the United States did what they did because they thought, okay, if we rebuild Europe, we rebuild Japan, everybody, their economies are going to be okay. And if the economies are going to be okay, we're going to have peace in the world. So, that's based on that mentality of, if you're, and usually in the West, that's the reality, but not with other mentalities, other philosophies like Islam.
Yeah.
Um, and, as you said, they may have had the good desire of helping everybody, but I think mainly was, hey, if everybody is doing okay economically, then we're going to have peace. We're going to achieve peace and we're going to benefit from it.
That was essentially the argument I think President Trump was making to uh, Kim Jong Il in North Korea
Mm.
is, hey, give up your ambitions for war, for nuclear weapons, and we'll make you prosperous like we are. Um, so that idea, but
Yeah.
without Christ, like what prosperity will we have that's lasting? You know.
Hmm. Yeah. Anyway, so you want me to pray,
Please,
Greg?
if you would pray from someone who's, um, are you an American citizen, Jackie?
Yes. Yes.
So you're
Yes,
American,
I
but
am.
you're living abroad. Are you,
Yeah,
but you're also a Colombian citizen, no? Or
exactly. Yes. And I live in Panama. So,
yes.
yeah, and I immigrated legally to the United States. So
Wait a minute.
it's,
ICE is not coming for you?
what is that?
I'm just joking. ICE is the immigration services.
Well, yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, no, I'm outside, so they cannot catch me. No, I'm just kidding. Uh, Anyway, so
You're,
yeah,
you
no,
are you are American.
yes, I am. I am an American and married to an American, and my children have, yeah, the American citizenship too. Yeah.
Amen. Would
So,
you pray for us?
Okay. Yeah, Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity that you gave us to pray. To getting together and understand a little bit more about the need to really pray for wisdom for this administration in the United States, wisdom and fear of the Lord coming into President Trump's heart, and not only him, but everybody who is in his team, as secretaries, as advisors, as envoys, as ambassadors, everybody who is working in this administration. Lord, we just ask that you open their eyes to the understanding of the need to seek your face and realize that we are facing very difficult situations right now, but it will be even worse if we wait. That the only solution is from you, that our help comes not from the mountains or from anything else, but the help comes from you, Lord, that we really need to seek your face and just do as Second Chronicles 7:14 says, Lord, seeking your face, repenting, humbling before you, and just waiting on you for the strategy that will help us, not only as the United States, but also, as Greg mentioned, if the United States falls, many are going to fall, and including Latin America. There is a saying that says, when the United States sneezes, Latin America gets a cold. And Lord, we are not depending, Latin America doesn't depend on the United States either. We all depend on you, but we need for the leaders, the most important leaders, to understand that. Um, I have heard many times President Trump said, I am here because God saved my life to save America. Give him a humility to understand that it's all about you. It's all about you and what you want him to do at this time. These 4 years that you have given him, but it's all about you. That when people come to thank him, he should always reply, "Thank the Lord. Thank the Lord. I'm just a vessel." So, Lord, I'm asking for humility, and I'm asking also for strength, for understanding, for wisdom and fear of you on him and all the people that are in his team, Lord, realizing that it's only 4 years, and unless the hearts of people are changed, no matter what they do, things may change radically, and in 4 years we may get something even worse than what we had before, and it will everything go back to even worse uh, situation. So we thank you, Lord, for this opportunity. I bless everybody who has been here, Lord. Give us ears to hear so we can hear from you directly and pray accordingly to your will and to what is important in your heart, and really humble yourself, ourselves, seeking your face and understanding and sounding the alarm to other people, so we all together can make a difference by submitting to you and humbling ourselves to you. We thank you, Lord, and we thank you for Greg. We ask that you bless him, bless his family, continue to give him wisdom to sound the alarm and to know, how to guide other people. Other people, you're using him as your mouth to tell us about these things that are impacting and that will impact the world as a whole. So we thank you for him. We bless him. In Yeshua's name, amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you for those prayers. And thanks everybody for being a part of this today. Let's have hope and encouragement that God has things in hand. It may not be as we expect, but he is good and his mercies endure forever. God bless you guys. Jesus,
Blessings.
help
Amen.
us.
God bless
Bye,
everybody.
y'all.
Hey, we'll see ya.
Bless everybody.
Great discussion.
Blessings to all.